4:30 a.m. August 7, 1915. A whistle blows on a Turkish Regial line called the Neck. 150 Australian light horsemen climb out of their trench and begin running across 60 m of open ground toward enemy machine guns. Within 30 seconds, nearly every single one of them is dead. 2 minutes later, it happens again. Another wave, another 150 men. Same result, slaughtered before they make it halfway. 2 minutes after that, a third wave cut down just as fast. Then a fourth. 8 minutes, 372 men dead, 0 meters gained. This is not a battle. This is not even a fair fight. This is a calculated feeding of human beings into machine gun fire. A disaster. So concentrated, so utterly preventable that it would scar the Australian national memory for over a century. Before we go any further, if this story matters to you, if you believe these men deserve to be remembered, do me a favor. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. It doesn't have to be long, just anything to tell the algorithm that history like this matters. It helps us reach more people. It helps us make sure stories like this don't get buried. Because what happened at the Neck wasn't just tragedy. It was betrayal. How does something like this happen? How do commanders send wave after wave of men into certain death? And why doesn't anyone stop it? How do you lose 372 lives in the time it takes to boil water? We're about to find out. We're going minute by minute, decision by decision, wave by wave. From the men who charged to the officers who ordered it to the Turkish defenders who could barely believe what they were being asked to kill. This is the story of the Neck. The 8 minutes that broke hearts, destroyed families, and revealed the horrifying gap between courage and competence. Let's begin. To understand how 372 men could be sacrificed in 8 minutes, you need to understand the nightmare they were already living in. By August 1915, the Gallipoli campaign had been bleeding Allied forces for nearly 4 months, and it had achieved exactly nothing. The concept was bold. Force the Dinardel Strait. Knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Open a supply route to Russia, and relieve pressure on the Western Front. On paper, it was brilliant. In execution, it was catastrophic from day one. April 25, 1915. British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and Indian forces stormed ashore at multiple points along the Gallipoli Peninsula. They expected light resistance and a quick advance inland to capture the high ground and the forts controlling the straits. What they got was a Turkish army that refused to break, led by commanders like Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey. Ottoman forces held the ridge lines and poured fire down onto the beaches. Within hours, the Allied advance stalled. Within days, it became clear this would not be the swift victory anyone had imagined. By May, the front had frozen into trench warfare. The same brutal stalemate consuming France and Belgium had replicated itself on Turkish soil, and nowhere was it worse than the Anzac sector. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps held a coastal strip, barely a mile deep. It wasn't a defensive line. It was a death trap. Steep cliffs, narrow gullies, Turkish positions on every Regial line looking straight down into Australian trenches. Every move drew sniper fire. Every supply run risked shelling. There was no rear area. There was no safety. Water was rationed to a canteen per man per day in the sweltering Mediterranean summer. Flies swarmed in biblical numbers, spreading dysentery and typhoid. Men dropped from disease as often as from bullets. Latrines overflowed. Corpses from no man's land rotted in the sun because retrieval meant getting shot. And yet morale held. These were volunteers. Men who had sailed halfway across the world to fight for king and empire. Farmers from the Australian outback, clerks from Melbourne and Sydney, sheep shearers from New Zealand. They believed in the cause. More than that, they believed in each other. Mateship wasn't just a word. It was the only thing keeping men sane. If your mate was wounded, you brought him back, even under fire. If your section was ordered to hold, you held, not because of the officers, because the man next to you was counting on it. But belief and brotherhood don't stop. Machine gun bullets. By late July, the Allied command knew the truth. The Gallipoli campaign was failing. Something drastic had to be done, or the entire operation would collapse into humiliating withdrawal. So they rolled the dice one more time. The plan was massive and complicated. A fresh British corps would land at Slough Bay, 8 kilometers north of Anzac Cove on undefended beaches. Simultaneously, Anzac forces would break out of their beachhead and assault the Sari Bair mountain range, the high ground dominating the entire peninsula. If it worked, the Turks would be outflanked, their defensive line shattered, and the road to the straits would finally open. But it required perfect coordination. Multiple divisions attacking at night across unknown terrain, timing down to the minute. And above all, surprise. That's where the neck came in. The neck was a narrow saddle of ground connecting Russell's top held by the Australians to Baby 700, a low-rise held by the Turks. It had no strategic value. Capturing it wouldn't unlock anything. It wouldn't open roads or flanks or supply lines. But it sat directly opposite well-entrenched Turkish positions. And if the Australians attacked there loudly, visibly, violently, it would look like a major assault. Turkish commanders would have to respond. They'd hold reserves in place. They'd reinforce. They'd focus attention away from the real attacks hitting Chunuk Bair and Hill 971 to the north. The neck attack was a diversion, a feint, a noise maker. It was never designed to succeed. It was designed to bleed loudly enough to matter. And the men of the 3rd Lyre Brigade, elite mounted troops from Victoria and Western Australia, were chosen to make that noise. They weren't told they were a sacrifice. They were told they were part of a coordinated offensive, that New Zealand infantry would attack on their left, that a naval bombardment would suppress Turkish defenses, that if they moved fast, they could take the enemy trenches before the Turks recovered. None of that was true, but they wouldn't know that until the whistles blew. Next, we need to understand the ground they were being asked to cross, and why it was a killing field long before the first man climbed out of the trench. The neck was 27 m wide at its narrowest point. That's about half a basketball court. The distance from the Australian trench to the Turkish trench was 60 to 80 m depending on where you stood. That's roughly the length of an Olympic swimming pool. You'd think that's close enough to cross quickly. Close enough that men running at full speed might cover it in 10, maybe 15 seconds before the enemy could react. You'd be wrong. The neck sat between 2 rigial lines, like a shallow saddle. Russell's top on the Australian side, Baby 700 on the Turkish side. Between them the ground dipped slightly before rising again toward the Turkish positions. Every inch of it was exposed. There were no trees, no rocks large enough to hide behind. No folds in the earth deep enough to shelter a man. The weeks of shelling had stripped away what little scrub had once grown there. What remained was hard-packed dirt scattered with the debris of previous failed attacks and corpses. Bodies from earlier assaults still lay in no man's land. The Australians and Turks had arranged brief truths to bury some of the dead, but not all. In the August heat, the ones left behind had swollen and blackened. Flies covered them in shifting black clouds. The smell was unbearable, even from the trenches. Barbed wire stretched in uneven tangles across parts of the approach. Some sections had been cut during night raids. Others remained intact. In darkness, you couldn't see it until you were on top of it. And stopping to untangle yourself meant death. But the worst part wasn't the wire, or the bodies, or the lack of cover. It was the fact that the Turks could see every meter of ground the Australians would have to cross. The 27th Turkish Regiment held the line at Baby 700. These weren't conscripts or rear echelon troops. They were experienced infantrymen who'd been fighting since April and had learned their business the hard way. Their trench was deep, well constructed, and reinforced with sandbags stacked 2 and 3 high. Firing steps were cut at precise intervals. Overhead cover in key sections protected against shrapnel. Communication trenches ran back to secondary positions where reserves waited. But the real killing power came from the machine guns. Turkish Maxim guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. One gun covered the left approach. Another covered the right. A third covered the center. There was no dead ground, no safe angle of attack. If you advanced anywhere along the front, at least 2 guns had line of sight on you. Each Maxim could fire 600 rounds per minute. That's 10 bullets per second. Trained crews could sustain that rate for as long as ammunition and water for cooling lasted, and the Turks had stockpiled both. The riflemen added another layer. The standard Turkish Mauser held 5 rounds and could be reloaded quickly by experienced soldiers. Sighted at 60 to 80 m, there was no need to aim carefully. Point at the mass of men running toward you and pull the trigger. You'd hit something. Turkish officers had done the math. Their soldiers had presented their rifles on specific landmarks. A charred stump here, a rock there, the edge of a shell crater. When the Australians came, gunners wouldn't waste time adjusting. They'd simply fire at pre-measured points and let the Australians run into the bullets. And there was one more critical failure in Australian intelligence. They thought the Turkish trench was over 100 m away. Some maps showed 120 m. It wasn't. In places it was as close as 60 m. That meant the planned 7-minute artillery bombardment. Time to lift and allow the infantry to charge would give the Turks more time, not less, to recover and man their weapons before the Australians closed the distance. Not that the bombardment would matter. Anyway, Russell's Top wasn't a proper trench system. It was a hastily dug series of shallow scrapes in the earth, carved out under fire over weeks of fighting. In some sections, the trench was barely chest deep. Men couldn't stand upright without exposing themselves to Turkish snipers. There was no communication trench leading forward. No covered way to approach the jump-off point. Soldiers assembling for the attack had to cram into the front line shoulder to shoulder, stepping over each other, trying not to knock rifles or equipment into the dirt. There was no room to form up properly, no space to organize into assault lines the way the manuals described. When the whistles blew, men would have to climb straight up onto the parapet, fully exposed, and start running. No cover, no concealment, no suppressing fire from their own side because the artillery would have already stopped. Just 60 m of open ground and however many seconds it took for Turkish gunners to pull their triggers. The Australian battalion commanders knew this. Some had surveyed the ground themselves during lulls in fighting. They had seen the Turkish positions. They had measured the distances as best they could. They knew what would happen, but orders were orders. And at 4:23 a.m. on August 7th, the countdown to catastrophe would begin. But before the whistles blew, before the slaughter started, these weren't just soldiers. They were men, sons, brothers, volunteers who'd sailed halfway across the world believing they were fighting for something that mattered. Next, you need to know who they were. They weren't professional soldiers. The 3rd Light Horse Brigade was made up of volunteers, men who'd signed up in the fever of 1914 when the call went out across Australia. Farm boys, station hands, clerks, tradesmen, a lawyer, a bank teller, a blacksmith's apprentice. They had trained as cavalry, learned to ride, shoot from horseback, move fast across open country. But there were no horses at Gallipoli. The terrain was too steep, the beachhead too narrow, the supply situation too desperate to ship mounts across the Mediterranean. So the Light Horse fought on foot, riflemen in all but name. The 8th was recruited primarily from rural Victoria. These were men who knew long days, hard work, and wide open spaces. Farmers who could ride all day and still have energy to mend fences at dusk. Stockmen who'd driven cattle across hundreds of miles of outback. They were fit, resourceful, and proud. They took care of each other because out in the bush, your mates were often the only help within 50 miles. That culture didn't disappear when they put on uniforms. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander White commanded the 8th. A regular officer, he trained them hard in Egypt before the landing. The men respected him because he didn't ask anything of them he wouldn't do himself. White knew the attack on the neck was suicide. Within hours he'd be running through Turkish fire trying to stop the slaughter. Among the 8th ranks, Trooper Ion Idris, 23 years old, a prospector and bushman from Queensland, who kept a diary and would later become one of Australia's most famous authors. He'd survived the neck by pure chance, assigned to a support role that kept him out of the first waves. Lieutenant Colonel Antill's younger brother serving as a trooper. Antill was the staff officer who would refuse to stop the attack. That detail would haunt him afterward. Trooper Harold Rush, 21, from a sheep station outside Melbourne. He'd make it into a shell crater during the 3rd wave and lie there for 14 hours, pretending to be dead while Turkish snipers shot at anything that moved. Corporal Alexander Alec Wilson, 28, married with 2 children back in Victoria. He wrote his last letter home the night before the attack. It arrived 3 weeks after the telegram informing his wife he was dead. These weren't names on a monument yet. On the night of August 6th, they were living men joking quietly in the dark, checking their rifles, trying not to think too hard about the morning. The 10th drew heavily from Western Australia, men from Perth, the gold fields, the vast sheep stations of the interior. If anything, they were even more independent-minded than the Victorians. Western Australians had a reputation for being blunt, stubborn, and loyal to a fault. Lieutenant Colonel Null Brazier commanded the 10th. A lawyer in civilian life, he was calm, thoughtful, and methodical. His men trusted him because he listened. In the chaotic minutes before the 3rd and 4th waves, Brazier would physically stand in front of his men and argue with staff officers, trying to stop them from being sent forward. He'd fail, but not for lack of trying. Among the 10th, Captain Henry Debble, a doctor before the war. He volunteered for the Lyre instead of the medical corps because he wanted to fight alongside his mates. He'd be killed in the 3rd wave, shot through the chest 5 from the Australian parapet. Trooper Leslie Magger, nephew of a Victoria Cross recipient, carried his uncle's legacy like a weight. He'd die in the 2nd wave. Private Hugo Thrussell, 31, who would survive the neck and later earn the Victoria Cross in another action. But his citation couldn't erase what he'd seen on August 7th. After the war, suffering from what we'd now call PTSD, he'd take his own life. His Victoria Cross was sold by his family decades later to pay bills. The Australian government eventually bought it back. These men knew what they were walking into. Some of them, anyway. You don't spend months in the trenches at Gallipoli without understanding how machine guns work. But they also trusted their officers, trusted the plan, trusted that British and Anzac command wouldn't throw them away for nothing. That trust was about to be broken. Above White and Brazier sat Brigadier General Frederick Hughes, commanding the 3rd Lyre Brigade. Hughes was a regular, competent, and by all accounts, a decent man. But he was also a man trapped between loyalty to his troops and obedience to orders from above. When the attack started going wrong, Hughes would try to stop it. But his authority was limited. Stopping a coordinated offensive in the middle of execution required approval from higher command. And getting that approval took time. Time the men in the trenches didn't have. Above Hughes was Major General Alexander Godley, a British officer commanding the New Zealand and Australian Division. Godley had a reputation for following orders to the letter, even when the letter made no sense. He was distant from the front, insulated by staff officers, and more concerned with the operational timetable than the tactical reality his men were facing. When reports came back that the attack was failing, Godley didn't immediately cancel the remaining waves. The plan called for 4 waves at 2-minute intervals. And by God, that's what would happen. Further up the chain sat Lieutenant General William Birdwood, commander of the Anzac Corps, and General Ian Hamilton, overall commander of the Gallipoli expedition. Both were miles away from the Neck physically and mentally. Hamilton was aboard a ship offshore. Birdwood was coordinating multiple simultaneous attacks across the entire Anzac front. Neither had direct communication with the men dying at Russell's Top. That's how men die. Wholesale. Long chains of command, slow communication. Officers following plans instead of reality. And at 4:23 a.m., reality was about to collide with the plan in the most brutal way possible. On the evening of August the 6th, the men of the 8th and 10th Lyre moved into their assembly positions. They were told the attack would begin at 4:30 a.m. They were told a 7-minute bombardment would smash the Turkish defenses. They were told New Zealand infantry would attack simultaneously on their left, splitting Turkish attention and firepower. They were told to move fast, press the attack, and take the Turkish trenches before the enemy recovered. Some believed it, others didn't. But all of them prepared. They cleaned their rifles, fixed bayonets, checked ammunition pouches, wrote letters. Though many wouldn't finish them. Smoked, prayed, sat in silence. The trenches were packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder because there wasn't room to sit. The August night was cool, but sweat soaked through uniforms anyway. Adrenaline does that. Officers moved along the line, checking positions, synchronizing watches. That last detail, synchronizing watches, would prove catastrophic. Not every officer's timepiece matched the master clock at headquarters. Some were off by minutes. Minutes mattered. At 4:23 a.m., the Australian and British artillery opened fire. Shells screamed overhead and slammed into the Turkish positions. Explosions lit up the pre-dawn darkness. Dust and smoke billowed. For 7 minutes, the bombardment continued. The men crouched low, gripping their rifles, waiting. Then the guns stopped. Silence fell. Whistles were raised to lips, and 150 men prepared to climb out of the trench and run toward machine guns that were already trained on the exact ground they'd have to cross. What happened next took 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds would define a disaster that lasted 8 minutes and haunted a nation for a century. 4:30 a.m. exactly. Whistles shrieked along the Australian line. Go, go, go. 150 men of the 8th Lyre climbed onto the parapet and ran. For 3 seconds, there was only the sound of boots hitting dirt and heavy breathing. Then the Turkish machine guns opened fire. The first men dropped before they taken 10 steps. Not 1 or 2, dozens. Entire Sections collapsed as if someone had cut their legs out from under them. The Maxim guns traversed left to right in smooth arcs, bullets ripping through the assault line at chest height. Trooper William Jackson, 19 years old, was hit in the throat and head simultaneously. Dead before he hit the ground, Sergeant Thomas O'Sullivan took 3 rounds through the torso, stumbled forward. Another 5M, then fell face first into the dirt. Corporal James Thompson made it 15M, farther than most, before a bullet shattered his fur and another punch through his lung. He tried crawling back. A Turkish sniper shot him through the spine. The noise was overwhelming. Not individual rifle cracks, but a continuous roar like fabric tearing. Only 1,000 times louder. Bullets kicked up geysers of dust. Ricochets. Wind off rocks. Men screamed, though most of the screaming stopped quickly. The ones hit in the head or heart dropped silently. The gut shot and limb shattered screamed until blood loss or shock took them under. Lieutenant Thomas Redford, leading from the front as officers were trained to do, made it almost 20M. He was waving his men forward when a burst from a Maxim stitched across his chest. For bullets he spun sideways and collapsed. His men ran past his body. Most of them died within the next 5 seconds. There was no cover, no shell holes deep enough, no ground fold that offered safety. Some men threw themselves flat and tried to crawl forward, but that just made them easier targets. Turkish riflemen calmly took aim and shot them through the back or head. A few, maybe a dozen, made it halfway, 30M out of 60. They were the fastest, the luckiest, or both. But speed and luck run out fast when you're under concentrated fire from multiple machine guns and 200 rifles. Private Edward Murphy reached a shallow depression barely a handspan deep and tried to shelter there. Bullets tore through the dirt inches from his face. He pressed himself flat, waiting for a lull that never came. When he tried to move at dusk, a sniper killed him instantly. By the time 30 seconds had passed, the first wave had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The ground between the trenches was carpeted with bodies. Some lay still, others writhed, clutching wounds, trying to drag themselves back toward the Australian line. A few called for stretcher bearers, though no stretcher bearer could reach them through that fire. Not a single man from the first wave reached the Turkish trench. Not one. Lieutenant Colonel White stood in the support trench, watching through binoculars. He saw the wave go up, saw them start forward, then saw them collapse in clumps as if struck by invisible hammers. He lowered the binoculars, his hands were shaking. "Jesus Christ," someone said beside him. Nobody responded. Staff officers along the line were shouting into field telephones, trying to reach brigade headquarters, trying to get someone, anyone, to stop what was happening. But the plan called for 4 waves at 2-minute intervals, and 2 minutes was almost up. Down in the forward trench, the men of the second wave had just watched their friends die. They stood, pressed shoulder to shoulder, rifles in hand, knowing exactly what was waiting for them. Some were praying. Others stared straight ahead, faces blank. A few were quietly weeping. Their officers were screaming up the chain of command to cancel the attack. No answer came back in time. At 4:30 a.m., the whistles blew again. The second wave climbed out of the trench and ran straight into the same hell that had just destroyed the first. 2 minutes had passed since the first wave died. The men of the second wave had watched it happen from 3M away. They'd seen their mates climb out and get cut down before they'd made it 10 steps. They could hear the wounded screaming in no man's land. Now it was their turn. Whistles blew. Up. Move. They climbed. The second wave didn't run into empty ground. They ran over corpses. Bodies were everywhere. Sprawled on their backs, crumpled face down, twisted at angles bones shouldn't allow. Blood soaked into the dirt. In the dim pre-dawn light, It looked black. Trooper George Mitchell's boot came down on someone's arm. He stumbled, caught himself, kept running. 2 seconds later, a bullet took him through the jaw. He dropped beside the body he just tripped over. Private Colin Armstrong recognized his brother, lying dead 5 m from the trench. He had half a second to register it before machine gun fire tore through his midsection. He fell next to him. The Turkish gunners didn't hesitate. If anything, they were calmer now. The initial shock of the first assault had passed. They'd reloaded, adjusted fields of fire, and settled into the grim rhythm of slaughter. The Maxims swept left to right, right to left. Methodical, efficient riflemen fired in volleys, front rank shooting while the rear rank reloaded. No wasted motion, no panic, just disciplined industrial killing. Lieutenant Arthur DeHaan made it 12 m. A Mauser round hit him in the chest. He staggered, kept moving, took another round through the stomach, and went down. He'd die of his wounds 3 hours later, calling for water no one could bring him. Corporal Frederick Bulls threw himself into a shell crater already occupied by 2 dead men from the first wave. He lay there gasping, trying to press himself into the earth. Bullets cracked overhead. Dirt showered down on him. When he tried to peek over the rim, a sniper round missed his head by inches. He'd stay in that crater for 11 hours before crawling back under cover of darkness. But he was one of the lucky ones. Most of the second wave didn't even make it that far. In the Turkish trench, soldiers were shouting to each other in disbelief. They're coming again. Are they insane? A machine gun cruise loader turned to his gunner. Why are they doing this? The gunner didn't answer. He just kept firing. These were experienced troops. They'd fought the British at Gallipoli for months. They'd seen bravery and stupidity both. But this was something else. Watching men charge into certain death, not once, but twice shook even hardened soldiers. Still, they kept shooting. This was war. The Australians were trying to kill them. They returned the favor. A Turkish officer shouted down the line, "Conserve ammunition. Aim carefully." His men didn't need the reminder. At 60 m, you didn't have to aim carefully. You just pointed your rifle at the mass of running men and pulled the trigger. Within 40 seconds, the second wave had been destroyed. The ground was now thick with dead and dying. In some places, you couldn't see the dirt, just overlapping bodies. The screaming from the wounded was constant. Men with shattered legs dragging themselves backward. Men clutching stomach wounds trying to hold their insides in. Men calling for mothers, for medics, for God. And from the Australian trench, officers were screaming into telephones, "Stop the attack! For God's sake, stop it!" Lieutenant Colonel White was sprinting toward brigade headquarters. He had to physically reach Brigadier General Hughes because the field telephone lines were jammed with conflicting reports. "You have to cancel the third wave," White was shouting before he even reached Hughes's position. Hughes's face was ashen. "I'm trying. Godly staff won't confirm. There's no time. They're forming up right now." Messages were being sent up the chain, but Major General Godley was coordinating attacks across multiple sectors. The neck was just one piece. He didn't have real-time visibility into what was happening there. His staff officers were telling him the attack was proceeding as planned. On paper, it was 4 waves, 2-minute intervals supporting the main assault on Chunuk Bair. On the ground, it was mass slaughter. But the communication lag between battlefield and headquarters meant decisions took minutes to make and minutes more to transmit back down. The third wave had 2 minutes from the end of the second wave. Those 2 minutes were almost up. Down in the forward trench, Lieutenant Colonel Breyer of the 10th Lyre was physically blocking his men. Nobody moves until I get confirmation. A staff officer arrived breathless. Orders are to proceed as planned. That's murder. Those are the orders, Colonel. Brazier turned to his men. Their faces were pale. They'd just watched 300 of their countrymen get slaughtered in under 2 minutes. They knew exactly what was about to happen to them. Some were shaking. A few had tears streaming down their faces. But none broke ranks. Because they were soldiers. And soldiers followed orders even when the orders were insane. 4:34 a.m. The whistles blew. The third wave climbed out. And the Australians watching from the support trenches began openly weeping. Don't send them. For God's sake, don't send them. Anyone who'd watched the first 2 waves get annihilated. It's pointless. The Turks haven't been touched. We're just feeding them into the guns. The staff officer, a major who hadn't seen the killing ground himself, held up a piece of paper. Orders from division. The attack continues. Lieutenant Colonel Brazier stepped between the major and his men. I'm not sending them until someone up there understands what's happening. You have your orders, Colonel. My orders are murder. The major's face went red. Those are your orders. Behind Brazier, 150 men of the 10th Light Horse stood in the trench waiting. They could see the field smoke drifting over mounds of bodies, hear the cries of the wounded, smell blood and cordite. Some were openly praying, others had gone silent, faces blank with shock. Private Arthur Henderson was 18 years old. He turned to the man beside him. If I don't make it, shut up. Don't talk like that. Tell my mom I wasn't scared. He was terrified. They all were. Brazier was still arguing. Precious seconds ticking away. He was trying to buy time, hoping someone higher up the chain would finally grasp the situation and cancel the attack. No such order came. The major looked at his watch. It's time, Colonel. Brazier stared at him, then turned to his men. Fix bayonets. The rattle of steel filled the trench. When you go, don't bunch up. Spread out. Move fast. Don't stop for the wounded. His voice cracked on the last sentence. 4:34 a.m. whistles. They went. Trooper Harold Rush climbed out, took 3 running steps, and saw the man in front of him shot through the head. The body dropped so suddenly Rush almost tripped over it. He kept running. The man on his right took a round through the chest, fell without a sound. The man on his left was hit in the leg, screamed, went down, clutching the wound. Rush saw a slight depression ahead, maybe 20 m out. He sprinted for it, bullets snapping past his ears, kicking up dirt at his feet. He dove, hit hard, lay flat, gasping. Around him, men were dying just as fast as the first 2 waves. Private Arthur Henderson, the 18-year-old who'd asked his mate to tell his mother he wasn't scared, made it 8 meters. A machine gun burst, cut him down. He died instantly. Lieutenant Keith McGowan, leading his section, was hit 5 times in the torso within the first 10 seconds. He staggered, dropped to one knee, tried to shout encouragement to his men, then collapsed forward. Corporal Stanley Richardson reached a pile of bodies from the first wave and tried to shelter behind them. A bullet went through a corpse and into his shoulder. He bit down on a scream, pressed himself lower. The Turkish fire hadn't slackened at all. If anything, the gunners were faster now, reloading smoothly, firing in controlled bursts, making every round count. In the Turkish trench, the disbelief had turned to grim resignation. Again. They're coming. Again. Ammunition. Loaders ran forward with fresh belts for the Maxims. Riflemen reloaded from reserve stocks. An officer shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Even he didn't understand why the Australians kept coming, but his men kept shooting. By the 40 mark, the third wave had been destroyed. A handful of men had made it into shell craters or shallow depressions. They lay there pinned, unable to advance or retreat. Any movement drew instant fire. Harold Rush lifted his head slightly and saw the field between him and the Australian trench. Bodies everywhere. Some moving, most weren't. He put his head back down and stayed perfectly still. In the Australian support, trench men were weeping openly. Hardened soldiers who'd fought for months, crying as they watched their friends die for nothing. Sergeant sat down, put his face in his hands, and sobbed. An officer threw his helmet into the dirt. This is butchery. This is butchery. Lieutenant Colonel White was back at brigade headquarters in Brigadier General Hughes's face. 3 waves, Hughes. 3. Over 400 men dead and we haven't gained a single meter. I know. Then stop it. Stop the 4th wave. I'm trying. Godly staff. To hell with godly staff. You have the authority to halt this. Not without confirmation from division. White stared at him. You're going to let them die because you won't go over someone's head. Hughes looks like he'd aged 10 years in 6 minutes. His hands were trembling. I've sent 3 messages. I'm waiting for. There's no time. But there was still 1 wave left, and the clock was ticking. Toward 4:36 a.m. In the forward trench, the remaining men of the 10th Light stood frozen. They'd just watched the 3rd wave get massacred. The field was a killing ground, choked with bodies. Smoke hung in the air. The screaming hadn't stopped. A young lieutenant, barely 20 years old, turned to his captain, his voice shook. Sir, we can't go out there. The captain didn't answer. He was staring at the field, his face gray. A staff officer arrived out of breath. He carried a message slip. Men leaned forward, desperate to hear it led. The staff officer read it. His face went white. He looked up at Lieutenant Colonel Brazier. 4th wave is the attack is everyone held their breath. 6 minutes had passed since the first whistle blew. 372 men dead or dying. And the final wave was about to be decided by a message that had taken too long to arrive. The staff officer read the message again, as if reading it twice would change the words. The 4th wave is postponed. Attack suspended pending. When was this sent? Brazier grabbed the paper. The timestamp. Read 4:32 a.m. 4 minutes ago before the 3rd wave went over. Christ, someone whispered. But the message had only just arrived, delayed by jammed telephone lines. Confused relays, the chaos of simultaneous attacks across the entire Anzac front. Brazier looked at his watch. 4:36 a.m. exactly. He spun toward the men. Stand down. Nobody moves. The attack is down the trench line. 40 m to the left. Whistles blew. Not every section had gotten the message. In the chaos, with officers shouting conflicting orders, some units heard postponed, while others heard nothing but the scheduled whistle for the 4th wave. A lieutenant in the left section, following the timetable drilled into him for days, blew his whistle at exactly 4:36 a.m. His men, conditioned by training and discipline, climbed out. Brazier saw them going. No, stop. Get back. But his voice was drowned by rifle fire. The Turks didn't care which wave it was. Men on the parapet meant targets. Roughly 80 men went over before officers could stop them. Some sections obeyed immediately and dropped back into the trench. Others hesitated, half in, half out, before scrambling back under cover. But a full platoon on the left flank was already running. The Turks cut them down just as efficiently as the previous waves. Private Leonard Morris made it 15 m, shot through both legs. He collapsed, tried crawling back, took another round. Through the spine. Trooper William Davies got tangled in barbed wire 10 m out. He was struggling to free himself when machine gun fire found him. He died hanging in the wire. Lieutenant James Fitzgerald led his section forward, screaming encouragement. A Mauser round took him through the throat. He fell backward, blood spraying. In other sections, officers physically restrained their men. Captain Robert Sutherland grabbed 2 troopers by their webbing and yanked them back. Stay down. The attack's off. Sergeant Michael Quinn threw himself in front of 3 men climbing onto the parapet. Get back in the trench. That's an order. One trooper ignored him, climbed out. Anyway, and was shot dead within 5 seconds. The rest stayed. Lieutenant Colonel Brazier was running down the trench line, shouting at every section, "Attack is can-led. No one moves. Pass it down." The word spread. Whistles stopped blowing. Men who'd been preparing to climb instead sank back against the trench walls, shaking. By 4:38 a.m., the last of the 4th wave had fallen. The attack was over. For 10 seconds, there was nothing but the echo of gunfire fading across the ridge line. Then the screaming started. Wounded men scattered across 60 m of open ground, crying for help, calling for stretcher-bearers, begging for water, screaming for their mothers. The Turks stopped firing at movement. There was no movement left to fire at, just mounds of dead and the occasional twitch of a wounded man trying to crawl. In the Australian trench, men stood in shock. Some stared at the field, others turned away, unable to look. A few vomited. One private sat down and started laughing. High hysterical laughter that didn't sound human. An NCO slapped him. He stopped laughing and started crying instead. Lieutenant Colonel White climbed into the forward trench. He looked out at the killing ground. Bodies everywhere. Hundreds of them piled in places, scattered in others. Some face down, some on their backs, some in positions that didn't make sense. The earth was soaked with blood. Smoke drifted across the field. Flies were already gathering. White turned to an officer beside him. "How many?" "We don't know yet, sir." "Most of them." "Most of them." "Yes, sir." White sat down on the fire step and put his head in his hands. The Ottoman soldiers were silent. Machine gun crews sat back from their weapons. Rifle bolts rested open. Steam rose from the Maxim barrels. They'd fired so many rounds the cooling water was boiling. A young Turkish private stared at the field. "Why do they keep coming?" No one answered. An older sergeant shook his head. "Brave men, stupid officers." Another soldier was praying quietly, asking forgiveness for what he'd done. He'd killed at least a dozen men in the last 8 minutes. Enemies, yes, but men. A lieutenant walked the line, checking ammunition counts, making sure his soldiers were ready in case the Australians tried again. They didn't. 4:45 a.m., a Turkish officer sent a runner back to regimental headquarters with a report. Enemy assault repulsed. Estimate 300+ enemy casualties. Our losses: 4 wounded, none killed. The runner looked at him. 4 wounded. A few ricochets. 1 man hit by shrapnel from their bombardment. That's all. The runner ran. In the Australian support trenches, officers were trying to count heads. The 8th Light Regiment, nearly 240 dead or missing, over 130 wounded. The 10th Light Regiment, over 130 dead or missing, 80 wounded. Total: more than 370 dead, over 200 wounded out of roughly 600 men committed to the attack in 8 minutes for 0 meters of ground. Stretcher-bearers couldn't reach most of the wounded. Turkish snipers were still active. Any movements in no man's land drew fire. Men lay out there, bleeding, screaming, dying slowly. Some would lie there all day in the August heat before dying of shock or blood loss. A few managed to crawl back after dark. Most didn't. Captain Aubrey Darnell, the medical officer, worked frantically on the casualties who made it back to the trench. He was covered in blood within minutes. Bullet through the chest. Get him to the rear. This one's gone. Move to the next. Hold him down. I need to tourniquet this leg. Men were shot multiple times. 3 bullets. 5. 8. One trooper had been hit 11 times and somehow was still alive. Barely. Darnell would later write, I have never seen anything like it. Boys came back riddled with bullets. Some I couldn't save. Some I shouldn't have been able to save, but did most never. Made it back at all. By 5 a.m., the sun was rising over Gallipoli. The light revealed the full scope of the disaster. The neck, a strip of ground 27 m wide and 60 m deep, was covered in Australian dead. But the men lying in no man's land weren't just numbers. And the disaster wasn't just a tactical failure. What happened next, the questions, the rage, the search for answers, would define how Australia remembered this war. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rose, and in no man's land, men were dying slowly. Corporal Stanley Richardson lay behind a pile of bodies, a bullet lodged in his shoulder. Every breath sent fire through his chest. He could hear others crying out, some close, some distant. Water, for God's sake, water. Stretcher bearer. Somebody help me. Turkish snipers watched the field through rifle scopes. Any movement drew a shot. A man tried lifting his head. Crack. Down again. Another tried crawling. Shot through the back. The Turks weren't being cruel. They were being practical. Wounded men could still fight. Wounded men could crawl back and report positions. And from 60 m you couldn't always tell if a man was faking. So they shot anything that moved. Richardson learned quickly. He lay absolutely still. Didn't move his head. Didn't shift position. Didn't try signaling to the Australian trench. He'd stay there for 11 hours. Harold rush in. His shell crater had a dead Turkish soldier for company killed in an earlier skirmish. The body was badly decomposed. The smell was suffocating, but the crater was deep enough to hide in, and that meant staying alive. He could see other Australians nearby, some moving weakly, others already still. One man, Rush, thought it was Trooper Davies, had been hit in the stomach. He was crying steadily, a low, scheming sound. Every few minutes he'd call out, "Mom, Mom, please." It went on for 2 hours. Then it stopped. Australian stretcher-bearers were trying everything. Captain Darnell organized volunteers to go out after dark. We wait for nightfall. No lights. Move quietly. Bring back anyone still breathing. But nightfall was 14 hours away. Some wounded couldn't wait that long. A few men tried anyway. Private Joseph MacDonald crawled over the parapet at 6 a.m. moving slowly toward a wounded mate 10 m out. A Turkish sniper put a round through his head. He died instantly. Lieutenant Colonel White grabbed another soldier preparing to go. "You'll die before you get 5 m. "He's my brother, sir." White held him. "Your brother's dead. You will be too if you go out there." The man struggled, then broke down. White let him cry. In the trench, unwounded survivors sat in silence. Some stared at nothing. Others cleaned rifles mechanically, hands moving on autopilot while minds shut down. Trooper Ion Idris, who'd been assigned to reserve duties and missed the waves, moved through the trench, trying to account for his section. Anyone seen Thompson? He headshakes. Richards. He went in the first wave. Henderson dead. Idris kept asking. The answers were all the same. At 5:30 a.m., Brigadier General Hughes sent a preliminary report to Major General Godley. Attack on Baby 700 launched as ordered. Heavy casualties sustained. Estimates 60–70% losses. No ground gained. Request permission to recover. Wounded. Godley's headquarters was chaos. Reports flooding in from multiple sectors. The main assault on Chunuk Bay was stalling. The Suwa Bay landing was behind schedule. Communications breaking down everywhere. The Neck was just one piece of a collapsing offensive. At 6:15 a.m., God's response arrived. Casualties. Regrettable. Maintain current positions. Coordinate with Turkish command for temporary troops to recover wounded if feasible. Regrettable. Hughes read it twice, then crumpled the message and threw it across the dugout. Regrettable, he said to no one. 372 men dead is regrettable. By mid-morning, Australian officers were signaling the Turkish line. White flags went up, shouting across no man's land in broken Turkish and English. Truce. We want to collect our wounded. The Turkish commander sent a runner back to division. The answer came within the hour. Permission granted for a 2-hour ceasefire starting at 2 p.m. At 2 p.m. exactly, both sides stopped shooting. Australian stretcher-bearers climbed out of the trench and walked into the killing ground. The heat had been working on the bodies for 9 hours. Some of the dead were unrecognizable. Faces swollen, skin discolored. Flies covered everything. The smell made men gag, even through cloth masks. The stretcher-bearers worked quickly, wounded first. Anyone still breathing got carried back immediately. Harold Rush was found in his crater, dehydrated, sunburned, but alive. He could barely stand. 2 men helped him back. Corporal Richardson was pulled from behind his pile of bodies. The bullet in his shoulder had stopped bleeding, but infection was already setting in. He'd lose the arm 3 days later. They found men who'd been hit multiple times and somehow survived. Others who had taken a single bullet and bled out slowly. Private Edward Murphy, shot through both lungs, was still alive. When they found him, he died before they got him back to the trench. Trooper William Martin had been lying in the sun with a shattered pelvis for 9 hours. He was delirious, crying for water. They gave him a canteen. He drank, coughed blood, and died 2 minutes later. Of the roughly 200 men wounded in the attack, fewer than half were recovered alive. The rest died in no man's land. The stretcher-bearers also counted the dead, identified who they could, collected identification discs and personal effects. Some bodies were too badly damaged to identify. Others had been stripped of identification by shell blasts. Those went into the count as unknown. At 4:00 p.m., the ceasefire ended. The stretcher-bearers pulled back. They'd recovered 76 wounded and identified 241 dead. The rest would stay in no man's land. By evening, the butcher's bill was complete. 8th Light Horse Regiment, 24 killed or died of wounds. 138 wounded. 10th Light Horse Regiment, 138 killed or died of wounds. 80 wounded. Total 372 dead. 218 wounded. Out of 600 men in 8 minutes for 0 ground gained. Both regiments were effectively destroyed as fighting units. They'd need complete reconstitution. New officers, new NCOs, replacements shipped. From Egypt or Australia. That would take months. By comparison, the Turkish defenders suffered 6 killed and 9 wounded during the entire day. most from the preliminary bombardment, not the assault itself. In the trenches that night, men sat in small groups talking quietly. Why didn't they stop it after the first wave? Orders. Always orders. Orders to die for nothing. No one had an answer. Lieutenant Colonel Brazier sat alone staring at a list of names. Men he'd commanded. Men he'd trained. Men he'd sent to their deaths because a staff officer handed him a piece of paper. Lieutenant Colonel White was writing letters to families. Dear Mrs. Thompson, it is my painful duty to inform you. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, your son died bravely. He'd write 234 of them. Every single one. At brigade headquarters, Hughes was demanding answers from division. Why hadn't the bombardment been longer? Why wasn't the New Zealand attack coordinated? Why were waves sent forward after it was clear the attack had failed? Godley's response was cold. The operation was conducted according to plan. Losses, while heavy, were within acceptable parameters for a diversionary assault. Acceptable parameters. That phrase would haunt Hughes for the rest of his life. While 372 Australians died on a ridge line, the entire August offensive was collapsing. The main assault on Chunuk Bair, the one the Neck was supposed to support, had achieved brief success. New Zealand troops reached the summit on August 8. 4:12 seal, a hot 12 hours. They held the high ground. Then Mustafa Kemal led a counterattack personally, driving the New Zealanders off with bayonets and overwhelming numbers. The summit was lost. Hundreds of New Zealanders died. At Sula Bay, British forces landed unopposed on August the 6th. They had hours to advance inland before Turkish reinforcements arrived. They didn't move. Indecisive commanders dithered. Troops brewed tea on the beach. By the time orders came to push forward, the Turks had reinforced the heights overlooking the bay. Another opportunity wasted. Thousands more dead. By August 10th, the entire offensive had grown to a halt. No strategic objectives achieved. No breakthrough. No relief for Russia. Just casualty lists. The Neck was a microcosm of everything wrong with Gallipoli. Brave men, incompetent planning, rigid command, and slaughter. Mistaken for strategy. But the disaster raised questions that went beyond tactics. Questions about who was responsible and whether anyone would be held accountable. In the days after the Neck, investigators tried reconstructing the decision chain. They wanted to know how 372 men could be killed in 8 minutes, without anyone stopping it. What they found wasn't a single catastrophic mistake. It was a cascade of failures, each one small enough to overlook, but together lethal. The Neck attack was never designed to succeed. That wasn't a secret. Brigade and regimental commanders knew it. Staff officers knew it. The operational orders spelled it out clearly. Diversionary assault to fix enemy attention and prevent reinforcement of Sari Bair sector. Translation: make noise, draw, fire, die loudly enough that the Turks keep troops in place instead of moving them north. The plan assumed acceptable losses. It assumed most men wouldn't reach the Turkish trench. It assumed the attack would fail tactically, but succeed strategically by tying down enemy reserves. But there was a critical miscalculation. The planners assumed the Turks had reserves at the Neck that could be drawn away from Chunuk Bair. They didn't. The 27th Turkish Regiment, holding Baby 700, was a static defensive unit. They had no mobile reserves to redeploy. They weren't going anywhere regardless of what the Australians did, meaning the entire premise that attacking the Neck would prevent Turkish reinforcements elsewhere was false. The men died for a diversion that diverted nothing. Australian intelligence estimated the Turkish trench was 100 to 120 m from Russell's top. It wasn't. In places it was as close as 60 m. That 40 m error meant everything. The attack plan called for a 7-minute artillery bombardment to suppress Turkish positions, followed immediately by the infantry assault. The assumption was that Turkish defenders, stunned, disoriented, and still in their dugouts would need time to man their weapons. At 100+ meters, that might have been true. Australians running across open ground at full sprint could cover 100 meters in roughly 12 to 15 seconds. If the Turks needed 10 seconds to climb out of cover and get to their firing positions, the Australians might close half the distance before taking heavy fire. At 60 m, there was no gap. Turkish soldiers climbed out of their dugouts, reached their weapons, and opened fire while the Australians were still 50 m away. And the intelligence failure went deeper. Australian scouts reported the Turkish trench was lightly manned, perhaps 80 to 100 soldiers. Wrong again. The 27th Regiment had over 200 men in the forward positions, plus machine gun crews. No one caught the error before the attack. At 4:23 a.m., Australian and British artillery opened fire. Shells hit the Turkish positions for 7 minutes, or they were supposed to. The bombardment stopped early. The exact reason has never been fully confirmed, but the most credible explanation is unsynchronized watches. Not every battery commander's timepiece matched the master clock at headquarters. Some batteries stopped firing at 4:29 a.m., others at 4:30 a.m. A few continued until 4:31 a.m. The result, the bombardment was uneven and ended before the infantry attack began. This gave Turkish defenders critical seconds, sometimes a full minute, to climb out of their shelters, man their weapons, and prepare. By the time the first wave charged at 4:30 a.m., the Turks were ready. But even if the timing had been perfect, the bombardment wouldn't have worked. Most of the shells fell short or long. The Turkish trench was narrow and well constructed. Shells that missed by even a few meters did no damage. And the 7-minute duration wasn't long enough to destroy hardened positions. The attack plan assumed the bombardment would neutralize Turkish defenses. It didn't even scratch them. The operational plan called for simultaneous assaults across multiple points. The Australians would hit the neck at 4:30 a.m. New Zealand infantry would attack Tunick Bear at the same time. British forces at Sule Bay would push inland. Coordinated pressure. Divided Turkish attention, mutual support. Except the New Zealanders didn't attack at 4:30 a.m. They were delayed. Rough terrain, darkness, confusion in the chain of command. They didn't reach their jump-off positions until after 5 o'clock a.m., half an hour late. By the time they attacked, the neck assault was already over. This meant the Australians went forward alone. Every Turkish gun at Baby 700 was trained on them. There was no split focus, no divided fire, just concentrated slaughter. If the New Zealanders had attacked on time, Turkish defenders would have faced threats from 2 directions. They'd have had to choose where to commit their fire. The Australians might have had a chance, slim, but real. Instead, they ran into undivided firepower. And no one told the Australians the New Zealand attack was delayed. They charged, believing support was coming. It never did. Once the attack began, stopping it required sending orders down a chain of command that moved at the speed of runners and field telephones. Here's what that looked like in practice. 4:30 a.m. First wave goes over, destroyed in 30 seconds. 4:31 a.m. Officers at Russell's Top realize the attack has failed. They send a message to Brigadier General Hughes at Brigade HQ. First wave destroyed. Request cancel. Remaining waves. The message goes by runner. It takes 3 minutes to reach. Hughes. 4:34 a.m. Hughes receives the report. He immediately tries a Honda's. Contacting Major General Godley at Division HQ by field telephone. The line is jammed. Too many units calling in. Reports simultaneously. Hughes sends a written message by motorcycle courier. Assault at Baby 700 failed. Heavy casualties. Request permission to cancel. Further waves. 4:35 a.m. The courier leaves. It will take 12 minutes to reach Division HQ. Meanwhile, at the front line, the second and third waves have already gone over. By the time Hughes's message reaches Godley, over 450 men have charged. 4:47 a.m. Godley's staff reads Hughes's message. They draft a response and send it back, but Godley is coordinating attacks across the entire Anzac front. The neck is one sector among many. His staff officers tell him the attack is proceeding according to plan. They don't have real-time information about the casualties. The response reads, continue as planned. 4 waves at 2-minute intervals. That message was drafted after the 4th wave had already been sent forward in some sections and cancelled in others. It arrives at 5 as of 3 a.m. By then, the attack is over. 372 men are dead. The communication lag made it impossible to stop the disaster in real time. British and Australian military doctrine in 1915 emphasized obedience and adherence to plans. Once an attack order was issued, junior officers had no authority to cancel it, even if battlefield conditions made it suicidal. Lieutenant Colonel Brazier physically tried stopping the 4th wave. He delayed it as long as he could, arguing with staff officers. But he couldn't outright refuse the order without facing court-martial for disobeying in the face of the enemy. Similarly, Brigadier General Hughes couldn't unilaterally cancel the attack without authorization from Godley. The doctrine created a system where men on the ground who could see the slaughter happening were powerless to stop it, while men in headquarters who couldn't see it made the decisions. Flexibility was considered weakness. Initiative was discouraged. Orders were orders. So the attack continued long after everyone at the front knew it had failed. After the battle, there was no formal investigation, no courts-martial, no inquiries, no one relieved of command. Godley remained in his position. Hughes kept his brigade. The staff officers who sent the waves forward faced no consequences. The official report, written weeks later, described the neck as a bold attack executed with great gallantry, resulting in heavy but unavoidable casualties. Unavoidable. The word appeared 3 times in the report. But the failures weren't unavoidable. They were the result of poor intelligence, mistimed artillery, lack of coordination, and a command system too rigid to adapt. Lieutenant Colonel White submitted a detailed after-action report outlining every failure. It was filed and ignored. Brazier wrote to his superiors demanding answers. He received a form letter thanking him for his service. The families of the dead received telegrams. Regret to inform you. Killed in action. Died bravely. No explanation. No admission of error. No accountability. And so the lessons went unlearned. 3 months later, the Allies evacuated Gallipoli, ending the campaign in failure. The only operation executed successfully was the withdrawal, conducted in silence at night with minimal casualties. It proved the Allies were capable of competent planning and execution. They just hadn't bothered at the neck. But the neck wasn't just a military disaster. It became a scar on Australia's national memory, a symbol of courage wasted, trust betrayed, and lives spent for nothing. And the way Australia remembered it has shaped how the country saw itself for generations. The news took weeks to reach Australia. Telegrams arrived first. Ter official. Identical. Regret to inform you that your son, husband, brother was killed in action on August 7, 1915. Then the letters from surviving officers. Then the newspaper reports. Heavily censored, describing a gallant but costly assault and heroic sacrifice. In the Empire's cause. What they didn't say, the men had been fed into machine guns for nothing. That truth came later. In survivor accounts, in whispered conversations between returned soldiers. In the gaps between what the government said and what the families knew. And when Australians finally understood what had happened at the Neck, it changed how the country saw the war and itself. Trooper Ion Idris survived Gallipoli and came home with notebooks full of observations. He'd become a writer and, in 1932, he published a memoir that included his account of the Neck. He didn't glorify it. He described it plainly. Men walking into machine gun fire because they were ordered to. Bodies piled in the dirt. Screaming that lasted hours. Friends dying for a diversion that diverted nothing. Australian readers were shaken. This wasn't the heroic narrative they'd been sold during the war, but it rang true. Because by the 1930s, thousands of returned soldiers were finally talking and their stories matched Idris's. Other accounts followed. Lieutenant Colonel Brazier wrote privately about his attempts to stop the fourth wave. His letters published after his death revealed the chaos and desperation in the command chain. Harold Rush, who'd survived 11 hours in a shell crater, gave interviews describing the Turkish fire, the smell of the dead, the helplessness of lying in the open waiting to be shot. These weren't propaganda pieces. They were testimony. And Australians listened. By the 1920s, Australia was building a national mythology around the Anzac experience. Gallipoli had become sacred ground, the place where the nation was born in blood and sacrifice. The Anzac legend emphasized courage, ship, endurance, and resourcefulness. It celebrated the Australian fighting man as uniquely tough, independent, and loyal. The Neck fit awkwardly into that narrative. Yes, the men showed courage. Extraordinary, almost unbelievable courage. Running into machine gun fire, not once, but 4 times, took a level of bravery most people can't comprehend. But the Neck also exposed something darker. That courage could be wasted. That British officers could spend Australian lives like currency. That bravery without competent leadership was just organized suicide. So the Neck became a different kind of symbol. Not triumph, not victory, but endurance in the face of betrayal. It became shorthand for the idea that Australian soldiers were let down by distant commanders who didn't understand the battlefield and didn't care enough to learn. That narrative, Australians as brave, British command as incompetent, would shape how Australia saw its military history for the next century. Charles Bean was Australia's official war correspondent and later the official historian. He'd been at Gallipoli. He'd seen the aftermath of the Neck. When he wrote the official history in the 1920s, he included a detailed chapter on the attack. He didn't hide the failures. He named officers quoted from after-action reports, described the communication breakdowns and planning errors. But he also emphasized the heroism, the men who went forward knowing they'd die. The mateship that held units together even in catastrophic defeat. Bean's account walked a fine line, honoring the dead without endorsing the decisions that killed them. His history became the authoritative version for decades. School children read excerpts. Anzac Day speeches quoted it. Memorials referenced it. And the phrase being used, the charge at the Neck, entered Australian vocabulary as a metaphor for futile bravery. For most of the world, the Neck remained obscure until 1981, when Australian director Peter Weir released Gallipoli. The film followed two young runners played by Mel Gibson and Mark Lee from enlistment through training to the disaster at the neck. The final scene showed the attack in brutal, unflinching detail. Waves of men climbing out and being cut down instantly. It wasn't Hollywood heroism. It was slaughter. The film's climax focused on a runner racing to deliver a message canceling the attack, arriving seconds too late. The final frame froze on Mark Lee's character mid-stride as he charged into Turkish fire. Gallipoli became a cultural phenomenon in Australia. It introduced a new generation to the story and reshaped how the world saw Gallipoli. International audiences were stunned. Many had never heard of the neck. The film's depiction of British incompetence and Australian sacrifice sparked debates about command, responsibility, and the human cost of war. For Australians, it became the definitive visual representation of the neck. School curriculums included it. Veterans praised its accuracy. Families of the dead wept watching it. The film cemented the neck's place in national memory, not as a footnote, but as the central tragedy of Gallipoli. The neck itself is a small, quiet place today. A stone memorial marks the spot. Visitors can stand where the Australian trench was and look across the narrow strip of ground to where the Turkish position sat. 60 m. It looks like nothing, a short sprint until you imagine running it under machine gun fire. The memorial lists the regiments involved, the dates, the casualty numbers. It doesn't explain why it happened or who was responsible, just the facts. Every year on Anzac Day, April 25th, Australians gather at the neck for dawn services. Prayers are read, the last post is played, wreaths are laid. Turkish officials often attend. The relationship between Australia and Turkey, former enemies, has been shaped by mutual respect for the courage shown on both sides at Gallipoli. In 1934, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who commanded Turkish forces at Gallipoli, wrote words that now appear on a memorial at Anzac Cove. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mamits to us where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. That message extended to the neck. Turkish descendants of the 27th Regiment have met with Australian descendants of the Lyre. They've shared stories, shaken hands, wept together. The battlefield became a place of reconciliation, not resentment. The neck left lessons that shaped Australian military and political culture, skepticism of authority. Australians came out of Gallipoli, and particularly the neck, with deep distrust of distant commanders making life and death decisions without battlefield knowledge. That skepticism persists in Australian military culture today. Insistence on competent leadership. Australian military training emphasizes flexibility, initiative, and battlefield awareness. Officers are taught to question orders that don't make tactical sense. That's a direct legacy of the neck. Messship above rank, the bonds between soldiers, looking out for each other, refusing to abandon wounded mates became central to Australian military identity. The neck reinforced that men went forward not because they believed in the mission but because their mates were going. Remembering the cost. Australia doesn't celebrate military victories the way some nations do. Anzac Day isn't about triumph. It's about sacrifice. The neck embodies that courage honored but waste mourned. Most of the men who survived the neck carried it for the rest of their lives. Harold Rush came home married, had children. He rarely spoke about the war, but his family said he'd wake screaming some nights, reliving the shell crater and the bodies around him. Trooper Ion Idris became a successful author, but his later years were marked by depression and nightmares. The notebooks he kept at Gallipoli haunted him. Hugo Thrust, who survived the neck and later won the Victoria Cross, returned to Australia a hero. But he couldn't adjust to civilian life. He struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD. In 1933, destitute and broken, he shot himself. His Victoria Cross was sold by his impoverished family in 1970. The Australian government eventually bought it back for the nation. Lieutenant Colonel Brazier returned to his law practice. He avoided speaking publicly about the neck for years, but in private letters he was haunted by the men he'd sent forward. He died in 1953, having never fully reconciled with what happened. Brigadier General Hughes lived into the 1960s. He gave interviews late in life, still defending the decision to proceed with the attack. Orders were orders, he said, but those who knew him said he never stopped second-guessing himself. The Turkish defenders of Baby 700 also carried memories. Some expressed regret at killing so many brave men. Others simply said they'd done their duty. A few wrote that they admired the Australians for their courage, even as they shot them down. War rarely produces clean narratives. The neck is no exception. So what do we take from the neck today? What does it mean more than a century later when the last survivors are long dead and the battlefield is a memorial site for tourists? It means this courage is not enough. Bravery must be matched by competence. Soldiers deserve leaders who won't waste their lives. And when we ask men to die, we owe them a reason. Worth it. Cost. The neck had no such reason. And that's why we remember it. Not to celebrate, but to mourn and to make sure it never happens again. If you visit the neck today, you'll find it quiet. Scrubby grass, a few scattered stones, a memorial plaque. The Turkish trench line is still visible if you know where to look. A slight depression in the earth, overgrown now, peaceful. It's hard to imagine what happened there. Standing on that ground, 60 m feels like nothing. You could walk it in 15 seconds, run it in 10. But on August 7, 1915, it was the distance between life and death. And 372 men didn't make it across. Let's be clear about what happened. 600 men committed to the attack, 372 killed in 8 minutes, 218 wounded, many of whom died later from their injuries. Total casualty rate 85%. Ground gained 0 m. Turkish casualties, 6 killed, 9 wounded. This wasn't a battle. It was a mismatch so one-sided it barely qualifies as combat. The Australians didn't lose because they were cowards. They lost because they were asked to do the impossible and did it anyway. That's the tragedy. Not that they failed, but that they tried. The men who died at the neck didn't ask to be remembered as heroes. Most of them probably didn't think of themselves that way. They were farmers, stockmen, clerks, kids really, most in their early 20s. They enlisted because it seemed like the right thing to do because their mates were going, because they believed the war mattered. And they died because a series of officers, some incompetent, some just following orders, sent them into machine gun fire without adequate planning, without proper support, and without the flexibility to stop when it became clear the attack had failed. So what do we owe them? We owe them the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic sacrifice in a noble cause version. The truth. They were wasted. Their courage was real, but it was spent on a plan that never made sense and a diversion that diverted nothing. We owe them the refusal to let this happen again. Modern militaries study the neck in staff colleges. It's taught as an example of everything you don't do. Bad intelligence, poor coordination, rigid command, failure to adapt. The Australian Army, in particular, built an entire doctrine around the lessons of Gallipoli. Flexible command, initiative at junior levels, skepticism of plans that ignore battlefield reality. The neck taught them that bravery without competence is just organized death. And we owe them remembrance. Not the kind that glorifies war, the kind that honors the cost. Every name on the memorial at the neck was a son, a brother, a husband, a mate, someone's whole world. 372 whole worlds ended in 8 minutes. Their families mourned them. Their communities never forgot them. And Australia built part of its national identity around the idea that men like them deserved better than what they got. The neck isn't ancient history. The last veteran of Gallipoli, Alec Campbell, died in 2002. He was 103. He hadn't fought at the neck, but he'd known men who did. DNA technology has allowed researchers to identify remains still being discovered at Gallipoli. In 2014, bones found near the neck were matched to Trooper James Martin of the 10th Light Horse. His family, great-grandchildren he never met, buried him properly. 99 years after he died. The story lives because the people who carry it refuse to let it die. And maybe that's the point. History isn't just dates and battles and casualty figures. It's people, decisions, consequences. The neck is a reminder that every name on a war memorial was a life. Every statistic was a person who laughed, loved, feared, and hoped. And when we forget that, when we reduce war to strategy and tactics and acceptable losses, we risk repeating the mistakes that killed them. 372 men died at the neck in 8 minutes. They didn't die storming a critical position. They didn't die holding a vital line. They didn't die in a climactic battle that turned the tide of war. They died because a plan demanded it. Because orders required it. Because the system couldn't stop it in time. And that's the horror. Not that men die in war. That's always been true. But that they can die for nothing. And the machinery of command will grind on, calling it regrettable and unavoidable. And moving to the next operation. The men at the neck deserved better. They deserved intelligence that was accurate. Artillery that worked. Commanders who could adapt. A system that valued their lives as much as it valued the plan. They didn't get it, but we can make sure their story isn't forgotten. We can make sure future generations understand what happened and why it should never happen again. That's why we tell these stories. Not to glorify war, not to celebrate empire, but to remember the cost and to honor the men who paid it. If this story mattered to you, if you think these 372 men deserve to be remembered, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We're covering the battles they don't teach in schools, the human cost behind the history books, the stories that need to be told. Drop a comment below. What do you think could have stopped the neck? What should we cover next? Share this video. The algorithm buries history that doesn't fit neat narratives. Help us fight that. And if you want to go deeper, if you want more stories like this, check out the links in the description. We've got hours of content on Gallipoli, the Western Front, and the forgotten battles of World War I. This is dark history. We don't forget, and neither should you. August 7th, 1915. 4:30 a.m. to 4:38 a.m. 372 dead, 218 wounded, 8 minutes, 0 meters gained. Never forget.